Imagine you're waking up in this freezing pre-dawn mist.
Yeah, bitter cold.
Right, it's March 18th, 1871. You're standing on the steep cobbled incline of the Butte of Montmartre, looking out over the sleeping city of Paris.
Just a miserable morning, honestly. Smells like wood smoke and, well, desperation.
Exactly. And through the darkness, you can just make out these dark silhouettes of 171 bronze cannons. But, and this is the key here, these aren't just military artillery pieces.
No, they're not.
These are your cannons. You and your neighbors, the working people of Paris, literally pooled your pennies to pay for them.
Bought and paid for by the people.
Right. And suddenly, the silence breaks. You hear the clinking of leather harnesses, metal buckles, and the thud of regular army boots marching up the hill.
It's a secret dawn raid.
By your own national government. They are coming to steal those guns and basically reassert control over a city that has just gotten entirely too radicalized for their liking.
And, at first they move fast. Under the cover of darkness, the troops secure the plateau.
They actually pull it off.
Yeah, they surround the cannons, neutralize the handful of local guardsmen on watch. So, by any conventional military standard, the operation is a total success before the sun even comes up.
They have the high ground.
Right. They have the heavy weapons. All they have to do is roll them down the hill to their secure headquarters.
Which brings us to, honestly, one of the most stunning, just absolutely consequential moments of logistical incompetence in modern history.
Almost hard to believe.
It really is. The regular army troops are standing there in the freezing rain, gripping the cold bronze of the cannons, ready to move them. And then this ripple of realization goes through the ranks, and all this meticulous high-level planning for a decapitation strike against the Parisian working class. The generals forgot one crucial detail.
They forgot the horses.
They forgot the horses.
You cannot manually push 171 heavy bronze cannons down the steep, cobbled streets of Montmartre. I mean, it's treacherous.
You'd need, what, thousands of draft animals?
Yeah, roughly 2,000 horses. And the commanding officer simply didn't bring them. They didn't even bring the necessary coupling attachments to hitch the cannons if horses had magically appeared.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this isn't just some funny historical anecdote. The sheer absurdity of this alters the course of history.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the national government trying to violently reassert the state's monopoly on violence. They storm the hill, declare victory, and then they're forced to just stand there.
Highly visible.
Completely exposed. For hours, waiting for someone to go find the horses. It gives the working class neighborhoods the one thing the government couldn't afford to give them. Time. Time to wake up.
And when they do wake up, that multi-hour delay transforms a clinical military opulence into a spontaneous, chaotic, and ultimately victorious revolution.
So this is our focus today. Welcome to our deep dive. This is episode 3 of our 7-part series, The Smark and the Cannon, March 18th, 1871.
Glad to be here.
Today, our mission is to completely dissect the structural failures, the crushing socioeconomic pressures, and, the sheer absurd logistics that led directly to this spontaneous transfer of power to the armed proletariat in Paris, the birth of the Paris Commune.
And to understand how a missing team of horses led to the collapse of national authority, we're drawing on a vast, cumulative historical archive today.
We've got a lot to cover.
We do. We're pulling from meticulous social histories documenting the exact daily caloric intake of starving Parisians. We've got raw, visceral eyewitness accounts from the barricades.
And crucially, we are integrating the real-time structural critiques written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as these exact events were unfolding on the streets.
Real-time analysis, yeah.
But before we delve into the mechanics of this revolution, we have to issue a very clear, very explicit disclaimer for you, the listener.
Right, very important.
The source material we're examining today contains highly politically charged content. We are engaging with Marx's rigorous structural critiques of capitalism, passionate contemporary left-wing accounts, and the official, often ruthless records of the bourgeois state.
Lots of strong viewpoints.
Exactly. So we take no sides in the politics of 1871. Our singular job here is to impartially report the historical dynamics, the structural analyses, and the diverse viewpoints contained entirely within this original source material.
We're basically mapping the terrain of this conflict completely neutrally, analyzing the friction between classes and ideologies without endorsing any actor's position.
Right, and to properly map that terrain, you have to bring forward the foundation we built in the previous installments of this series. Think of our prior discussions as active, uploaded sources that form the bedrock for today's analysis.
It all connects.
It does. In episode 1, we established the physical reality of Haussmann's Paris. We analyzed the spatial and economic layout that intentionally pushed the working class out of the center.
Right. Yeah, segregating them into those dense, easily contained eastern and northern neighborhoods like Belleville and Montmartre.
And then, in episode 2, we dissected the ideological landscape, the limits of Proudhonism, the vanguard Pupkism of Auguste Blanqui, and the deeply fractured nature of the left factions.
And those spatial and ideological realities, they don't just disappear. They become the exact environment where the trauma of the Franco-Prussian War plays out.
Exactly. So today, we're going to see what happens when you take that geographically segregated, ideologically fractured city, completely arm its poorest citizens, and lock them in a freezing cage for 4 months.
Yeah, to really understand the explosion of March 18, we have to immerse ourselves in the agonizing physical conditions that forged this newly radicalized working class. We're picking up right where the catastrophic Franco-Prussian War left off.
The trap being sprung, right?
By September 19, 1870, the Prussian army has completely encircled Paris.
And this isn't, a traditional medieval siege with arrows over a wall. We have to analyze this as a profound, structural, socioeconomic strangulation of a modern metropolis.
The devastation is just absolute and prolonged. The Prussian siege lasts for 131 days.
4 months and 12 days of total suffocating isolation.
Yeah. And for a solid month of that, Paris is under direct, relentless artillery bombardment from Prussian guns. But honestly, the most effective weapon the Prussians deploy isn't artillery.
It's starvation.
It is starvation. The sources give us the exact, terrifying mathematics of this hunger. By January 15th, the daily bread ration for a Parisian is officially reduced to 300 grams.
Okay, 300 grams of bread. But we need to clarify what bread meant in this context, because it certainly wasn't wheat flour.
Oh, not at all. As the siege dragged on, bakers were mixing whatever they could find into the dough just to create mass.
Like what?
Sawdust, bone dust, straw, just unknown fillers. It was barely digestible. And a month prior to that, the meat ration had already been slashed to a mere 30 grams per person.
30 grams of meat. That's roughly the size of a large coin. That is barely a single mouthful. And I'm assuming it wasn't beef.
No, strictly horse meat by that point. The city had slaughtered its massive population of draft horses, carriage horses, even the military horses.
Wow.
And once the horses were gone, they moved on to the dogs, the cats, and finally the rats. And the disparity in how this starvation was experienced is staggering. It really highlights the deep social divides.
How so?
Well, the wealthy could still occasionally source heavily marked up delicacies on the black market, or they could fall back on vast stockpiles of preserved goods they had hoarded before the encirclement.
While the poor are left with nothing.
Literally searching the dirt heaps. We have primary accounts describing the horrific daily sight of starving people grubbing in the frozen gutter, desperately looking for discarded turnip tops or stray crusts of that bone dust bread.
Which brings us to a crucial structural point. We have to view the suffering through the lens we developed in episode 1. The physical siege acted as a brutal amplifier for the existing spatial segregation of Haussmann's Paris.
Right, the boulevards didn't protect anyone from starvation.
Exactly. The wide, beautiful, newly constructed boulevards did absolutely nothing for the working class. The siege stripped away the veneer of the cosmopolitan city and laid bare the raw class realities. The bourgeoisie might complain about, the inconvenience of paying exorbitant prices for a rat, but the proletariat in Montmartre and Belleville were facing actual imminent extermination by malnutrition.
And we cannot forget the environment itself. The cold was actively working alongside the hunger to kill them. It was recorded as the bitterest winter in living memory.
The Seine River froze over, right?
Completely froze over, flowing right through the heart of the city. And the city was plunged into near total darkness at night. The coal gas, usually used for streetlights and heating, had to be completely requisitioned by the government.
Okay, wait, what were they using the coal gas for, if not to heat the city?
They needed it for the observation balloons.
Ah, right.
Paris was trying to communicate with the outside world, specifically with the provincial armies they hoped were coming to rescue them. So the gas is diverted. They tried replacing street lighting with oil lamps, but then the oil was requisitioned for the war effort too.
So no heat, no light.
People were burning anything they could get their hands on. Furniture, park benches, doors, just to generate a tiny bit of heat. To survive the ambient freezing temperatures, a family needed to burn roughly 100 kilograms of wood a day.
And almost no one in the working class districts had access to that kind of fuel.
Exactly.
So you have generations of families who have only ever known hard, back-breaking industrial labor suddenly trapped in an environment that is actively, aggressively trying to kill them through frostbite and starvation.
The psychological toll this environment took is something the sources dwell on heavily. They actually coined a specific term for it: obsidianal fever.
Obsidianal fever.
Yeah, you have to remember that Paris considered itself the center of the civilized world, a massive hub of art, finance, culture. Suddenly, a wall of Prussian steel completely cuts it off from the rest of the planet. The only information getting in or out is via 65 incredibly perilous hot air balloon flights and a handful of carrier pigeons.
Think about the mechanics of that communication for a moment. You are relying on a bird to fly over enemy lines just to find out if the rest of your country still exists.
It's wild. The anxiety of waiting for a pigeon that might have been shot down or eaten by a hawk was agonizing. This total isolation created a deeply traumatized, highly strung population.
Just constant whiplash.
Relentless. One morning, a rumor spreads that a massive French provincial army is marching to break the siege. The city is swept up in wild optimism. The next day, the rumor is debunked, and the population plunges into the blackest, most desperate pessimism.
Okay, I want to challenge a foundational assumption here. If the conditions were genuinely this apocalyptic, if the temperature's below freezing, if people are digging turnip tops out of frozen mud, suffering from mass psychological trauma, why didn't the city just consume itself? Under those kinds of pressures, you'd expect a complete breakdown of social order. Mass rioting, looting, a descent into total anarchy. What mechanism held the Parisian working class together through 131 days of this torture?
The sources address this directly, and the consensus is pretty remarkable. The city did not descend into chaotic violence against itself because of a profound, almost unprecedented surge of class solidarity.
Solidarity over survival of the fittest.
Yes. The mortality rate more than tripled, primarily taking the young and the elderly. But contemporary observers, even the bourgeois politicians who actively hated the working class, were forced to note the immense moral energy, the discipline, and the courage of the Parisian populace.
They didn't turn on each other.
No. The official government records explicitly state that amidst this cascade of disasters, there was not a single day of discouragement in terms of their willingness to defend the city.
That's incredible.
The hardship didn't shatter their social fabric. It crystallized it. In those quartiers populaires, the dense working-class neighborhoods we mapped out previously, the shared trauma forged an unbreakable, hyper-local bond.
Shared suffering.
Exactly. Neighbors were sharing what little warmth and food they had. They were suffering collectively, and therefore they were surviving collectively.
And that collective survival mechanism is about to be weaponized. Because from the brutal physical reality of the siege, we have to transition to the specific economic lifeline that unintentionally took this traumatized, unified population and transformed it into a highly organized revolutionary army. We need to examine the massive expansion of the National Guard and the implementation of the 30-sous stipend.
Because the moment the Prussians encircled the city, the Parisian economy collapsed. Industry and commerce were completely paralyzed. Mass unemployment hit the working class overnight.
Hundreds of thousands of people with zero income.
In a city where the price of a rat was skyrocketing. So the provisional government realized they were sitting on a powder keg. To keep the poor from starving to death and to maintain some semblance of civic order, they dramatically expanded the ranks of the National Guard, opening it up to the unemployed masses.
They essentially put the entire working class on the state payroll.
Exactly. They offered a daily stipend of 1.50 francs, which translates to 30 sous, to any man who signed up for the Guard. And as the siege worsened, they realized this wasn't enough to keep families alive, so they added a supplement of 75 centimes for a spouse and 25 centimes for each child.
I want to pause on that detail regarding the spouses. The government extended this 75 centime supplement to common law wives, women who were not legally or religiously married to the guardsmen.
Which was huge at the time.
A massive, scandalous affront to the conservative bourgeois Catholic values of the time. But the state was so desperate to prevent mass starvation and rioting that they essentially had to legally recognize the informal family structures of the working class.
It was a necessary concession to reality. For tens of thousands of families, this incredibly paltry sum, just enough to buy the bone-dust bread, was the literal only thing standing between them and the grave.
And so the Guard swells?
Exponentially. But it didn't just grow in raw numbers. The influx of the working class, fundamentally altered the social and command character of the institution. It became thoroughly democratized.
And here is where it gets really interesting from a structural perspective. Think about the mechanics of a traditional military force. In a regular army, discipline is maintained through a strict top-down hierarchy.
Right. Generals at the top, grunts at the bottom.
Exactly. Officers are appointed by the state, almost exclusively drawn from the upper classes, the aristocracy, or military academies. The soldiers are conditioned to obey the officer class without question. But the expanded National Guard completely inverted this structure.
The guardsmen in Paris were granted the right to elect their own company officers.
And who are they electing?
They're not electing aristocrats or career military men. They are electing the people they trust in their immediate neighborhoods. The new captains and lieutenants of the National Guard are the local shoemakers, carpenters, printers, radical journalists,
Guys from their own street.
men from their own apartment blocks.
This alters everything. You no longer have an army that serves the abstract concept of the state. You have a heavily armed, highly organized force deeply rooted in local working-class geography. The discipline doesn't come from fear of a commanding officer. It comes from peer pressure, neighborhood solidarity, shared class interests.
It creates a localized militia that is ideologically aligned with the workers, because they are the workers.
So what does this all mean when we apply Marx's structural analysis, which is featured prominently in our source archive? By funding the National Guard with this 30-sou stipend, the provisional government essentially became the hard-pressed debtor of bourgeois society.
Taking bourgeois capital to fund a working-class army.
Exactly. The government is taking state funds and using it to feed, organize, train, and arm the proletariat.
Paying for the creation of an army entirely outside of their political control.
The sources explicitly draw a historical parallel here to the June 1848 uprising, a trauma that was very fresh in the minds of the French political class. Back in 1848, the state faced a similar crisis of mass unemployment. Their solution was to create a paid force called the Mobile Guard, paying them that exact same amount, 1.50 francs a day.
But the composition of that 1848 force was entirely different.
Crucially different. In 1848, the state intentionally recruited from what Marx termed the lumpen proletariat. We need to define this term clearly. The lumpen proletariat refers to the most desperately poor, the vagabonds, petty criminals, discarded elements of society who have no formal connection to industrial production and, critically, possess absolutely no class consciousness.
Right, they're unmoored from the labor struggle.
Because they lack class solidarity, their loyalty can be easily purchased. In 1848, the state bought the lumpen proletariat with 1.50 francs a day and successfully used them as a vicious weapon against the striking industrial workers. It was a cynical, brilliant strategy to divide the lower classes and play one faction off against the other.
But in 1871, that playbook completely fails.
It fails catastrophically. The state doesn't just recruit the lumpen proletariat, they recruit the actual industrial proletariat. The National Guard is the armed working class, complete with class consciousness and political organizations.
The government is handing weapons to the exact demographic that possesses the most profound structural grievances against them.
Imagine a modern scenario to really grasp the absurdity of this. It would be like a fiercely anti-union corporate government facing an economic crisis. And to prevent unrest, they accidentally decide to fully fund, arm, and provide military training to a massive, militant, decentralized labor union while simultaneously trying to break a nationwide strike.
It's suicidal for the state.
The state was heavily subsidizing its own existential threat. The bourgeoisie bought the guns, they organized the battalions by neighborhood, and they fed the men who would eventually point those guns right back at the halls of power.
And that profound miscalculation brings us to the ultimate, fatal paradox of the siege. Because the working class was now armed, highly organized, and radicalized by starvation, the national government, this provisional government, found itself trapped in a paralyzing contradiction.
Massive dilemma.
Right. They had to make a choice between winning the foreign war against the Prussians or maintaining domestic class rule over Paris.
This contradiction is the absolute crux of Marx's structural critique of the Franco-Prussian War. He argues that the government of national defense, the body that took power after Emperor Napoleon III was captured by the Prussians at Sedan, inevitably, structurally, had to function as a government of national defection.
Defection meaning treason, betrayal of the nation.
Precisely. And we must explain the mechanics of why the sources argue this treason was structurally inevitable. Look at the logistical reality of Paris. The city was surrounded by the most powerful, professional army in Europe. Paris could not possibly be defended, let alone break the siege, without fully mobilizing and unleashing the National Guard.
They'd have to use the workers.
The government would have to take these hundreds of thousands of working-class men, fully arm them, train them in open warfare, and allow them to achieve a military victory. But, as Marx pointed out, Paris armed was the revolution armed.
If the National Guard defeated the Prussians, they would become the undisputed saviors of France.
Exactly. A military victory over the Prussian aggressor achieved by the working class would have been, by default, a political victory of the French workmen over the French capitalists.
They'd hold all the cards.
The proletariat would have emerged from a victorious war holding all the heavy artillery, all the military glory, and absolute moral authority. They would have immediately dictated the terms of the new republic, dismantling bourgeois property relations.
The bourgeoisie simply could not allow that to happen. They looked at the geopolitical landscape and realized they feared their own armed citizens significantly more than they feared the foreign enemy bombarding their city.
Because Bismarck just wanted territory and money.
Right. Bismarck wanted land and cash. The armed proletariat wanted to restructure society.
This isn't just Marxist theorizing after the fact either. We have internal communications quoted in the sources that lay this out nakedly. Jules Favre, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and General Trochu, the military governor of Paris, openly admitted in letters to colleagues that the government was defending itself not against the Prussian soldier, but against the Paris workmen.
It's all right there in writing.
The parliamentary republic, which claimed to represent the unified spirit of the whole nation fighting off an invader, revealed itself to be a pure engine of class despotism. Their primary overriding objective wasn't to beat Bismarck. It was to find a way to safely capitulate to Bismarck so they could use the peace to disarm the proletariat.
Which leads inexorably to the capitulation. On January 28, 1871, after 131 days of insisting they would never surrender an inch of territory, Jules Favre signs an armistice with Bismarck.
Complete betrayal.
The terms imposed by Prussia are incredibly harsh, designed to permanently cripple French power. France has to pay a massive, unprecedented indemnity of 5 billion francs. They must surrender the resource-rich territories of Alsace and Lorraine. And, most humiliatingly for the pride of Paris, they must allow Prussian troops to march directly into the capital on March 1st and occupy a section of the city.
We need to examine the psychological impact of this surrender on the population. After 131 days of eating sawdust bread, watching their children die of frostbite, enduring constant artillery bombardment, how did the Parisian working class process the news that their leaders had essentially sold them out?
The reaction documented in the social histories is a visceral mixture of absolute suffocating grief and white-hot outrage. When the Prussian troops finally marched into the city on March 1st, it wasn't met with riots. It was met with a terrifying, organized silence.
A silent protest.
Yes. The streets along the occupation route were completely deserted. The National Guard had organized a total boycott. Black flags of mourning were hung from the windows of thousands of houses. The massive, iconic statues at the Place de la Concorde were veiled in heavy black cloth. The gas lights in that sector were intentionally left unlit.
It's ghost town.
A very angry ghost town. Any Parisian, specifically prostitutes, who dared to fraternize or speak with the occupying troops were violently attacked and publicly whipped by the crowds. It was a city in deep, profound mourning, but it was also a city that felt it had been stabbed in the back.
They realized that all the suffering, all the starvation had been a performance. The game had been rigged from the start by a government that never intended to win.
They had endured the unendurable, watched their families die, believing it was for the defense of the Republic. And for what? To be handed over to the enemy by their own generals. This betrayal severed the final, fraying thread of trust between the Parisian workers and the national government.
And the national government knows it.
Oh, yeah. The state authority was now headed by the conservative, deeply reactionary politician Adolphe Thiers. Recognizing the explosive anger in the capital, Thiers and his government completely abandoned Paris. They flee to the opulent royal palace of Versailles, leaving Paris as a heavily armed, furiously angry, autonomous zone.
So with the physical war against Prussia officially ending, the government in Versailles immediately pivots. The foreign war is over, so the domestic class war must begin. Thiers and the National Assembly launch a ruthless, highly calculated economic assault against Paris. And this is where I need to look at the legislative mechanisms of this assault.
It was a rapid-fire legislative bombardment. In early March, the newly elected National Assembly convened. And we must note the makeup of this assembly. It was overwhelmingly dominated by rural conservatives, monarchists, and provincial elites who held a deep historical hatred for radical Republican Paris.
They hated the city.
Viewed it as a den of socialists and atheists.
Yeah.
And they immediately passed a succession of crushing economic laws. First, they terminated the wartime moratorium on rents.
Let's break down exactly what that means for a family on the ground.
During the 4 months of the siege, the provisional government had decreed that no one had to pay rent, acknowledging the reality that industry had stopped and no one was earning wages. But now, in March, the Assembly decrees that the moratorium is instantly over, and landlords have the legal right to demand all back rent accumulated over the last 4 months, payable immediately.
Instantly due.
Instantly. If you couldn't produce 4 months of rent, and virtually no working-class family who had spent all their money on black market food could, you faced immediate legal eviction onto the freezing streets.
It is a breathtakingly cruel stroke. The state is weaponizing homelessness.
And they did not stop there. They also ended the reprieve at the municipal pawn shop, the Mont-de-Piété.
Explain the role of the pawn shop in the 1871 Parisian economy, because it's slightly different than how we might view it today.
The Mont-de-Piété was a central economic institution for the poor. During the darkest, most starving days of the siege, hundreds of thousands of Parisians had pawned literally everything they owned just to buy morsels of food. We aren't just talking about jewelry.
No, it was survival gear.
They pawned their winter coats, their blankets, and most importantly, the tools of their trade, their sewing machines, their carpentry tools. The government had previously frozen the sale of these items, allowing people to survive without losing their livelihoods permanently. Now, the Assembly decreed the pawn shops could immediately start auctioning off the people's possessions if the debts weren't paid.
They are systematically stripping the working class of their shelter, their warmth, and their physical ability to earn a living.
But the most devastating blow, the one that guaranteed a violent response, was the sudden end of the 30-sous stipend for the National Guard. The Assembly cut off that 1.50 francs a day.
The only income they had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For tens of thousands of families, that stipend was the sole source of income. By cutting it off, the government essentially legislated mass starvation back into existence just as the physical siege was ending.
And then comes the crowning blow of this legislative assault, the law of maturities.
Yes, the law of maturities demanded that all commercial debts, all promissory notes and bills of exchange that had been suspended during the war had to be paid in full, with interest, within 48 hours.
Let's analyze this law of maturities through a structural lens, because it is vital to understand that this wasn't just bad policy or a government acting callously out of spite. This was the bourgeois state attempting to forcefully, violently restore existing property relations and the flow of capitalist credit.
Restarting the machine.
Marx points out that capitalist credit rests entirely on the, quote, undisturbed and untroubled recognition of the existing economic class relations. During the siege, those normal relations were suspended out of sheer necessity. The state had to make concessions to the workers, moratoriums, stipends, freezing debt, just to keep the city functioning. But now, to secure their own power and restart the capitalist economic engine, the bourgeoisie had to strike off the fetters of those concessions. They had to aggressively remind the workers and the middle class who was in charge and who owned the capital.
But this is where Adolphe Thiers, the architect of this policy, miscalculated spectacularly.
I have to push back on this narrative of Thiers making a simple mistake. Adolphe Thiers is universally described in all our sources as a shrewd, incredibly calculating Machiavellian politician. He's a survivor of multiple regimes. If he was so intelligent, why did he drop the equivalent of an economic nuclear bomb on the exact population he was desperately trying to pacify?
Because he fundamentally misunderstood the dialectical result of his own legislation. He was so focused on punishing the radical proletariat that he failed to see how the mechanics of his laws would impact the broader economy. Think about the law of maturities like pulling the emergency brake on a speeding train. Thiers thought pulling the brake would stop the radical momentum. Instead, the violent deceleration threw all the passengers in the middle class violently forward into the engine room alongside the radicals.
How exactly did it hit the middle class?
Well, the law of maturities demanded payment of all commercial debts within 48 hours. The radical working class didn't have commercial debts, they had rent and pawn tickets. The commercial debts belonged to the small businesses. By demanding immediate payment when there was zero liquidity in the city, the law of maturities caused 150,000 immediate bankruptcies and defaults among small businesses.
150,000.
It instantly crushed the middle strata, the petite bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers, the clerks, the master artisans.
So the mechanics of the law actively unified the classes against the state. Instead of crushing the revolution, Thiers' economic violence pushed the middle class directly into the arms of the proletariat.
Exactly. The very people who usually supported property rights, the conservative shopkeepers who historically feared the Reds and the socialists, suddenly found themselves facing total financial ruin at the hands of their own bourgeois government.
Because they couldn't pay either.
Right. As one contemporary observer noted in the archives, the landlords have no reclaim against those whose only fortune is in their daily work. We shall pay when we can, and there will be many who will never pay. The assembly alienated the exact demographic, the middle-class moderates, that they desperately needed to maintain order in the city.
So Thiers watches this unfold. He realizes the economic assault isn't working fast enough. In fact, it's backfiring, creating a unified front against Versailles. He knows that business as usual cannot resume, credit cannot be restored, and the state's authority will remain a fiction until the physical threat to bourgeois power is neutralized.
The physical threat being the cannons.
The ultimate symbol of working-class autonomy, the artillery. The cannons sitting on the hills. Which brings us right back to where we started. The fateful morning of March 18th.
Let's set the scene again, with all this context in mind. It is 4:30 a.m. on March 18th. Thiers decides he cannot wait any longer. He sends regular army troops, commanded by General Vinoy, into Paris. Their primary objective: execute a surgical strike to seize the 171 National Guard cannons parked on the heights of Montmartre, and another batch in Belleville.
And we should explicitly connect this military objective to our last episode. Thiers' motivation here isn't just about collecting metal tubes. This is a targeted decapitation strike against the radical left's infrastructure. Thiers knows that Auguste Blanqui, the professional revolutionary we discussed extensively in episode 2, is the only man in France with the ruthless tactical capability to organize a successful armed response to the government.
He's terrified of Blanqui.
Exactly. By taking the cannons, Thiers hopes to break the back of the radical military capacity before Blanqui or anyone else can mobilize the angry populace.
Right. So General Vinoy's troops move in under the cover of darkness. They advance up the steep, winding, cobbled streets of Montmartre. It's a difficult climb, but by 6 a.m. they have successfully secured the plateau. The cannons are physically in their possession. The few National Guardsmen on duty are surprised, easily overwhelmed, pushed aside. It looks like a clean, successful, professional military operation. Thiers' gamble seems to have paid off.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly deeply farcical. We return to the missing horses.
It is a logistical farce of epic world historical proportions. The troops secure 171 heavy bronze cannons. But as they prepare to move them, they realize the fatal error. They did not bring the horses.
It bears repeating because the incompetence is just staggering. They planned a secret dawn raid to steal heavy artillery, and they forgot the horses.
To move 171 cannons down those specific steep inclines safely, you need roughly 2,000 horses. And they didn't bring them. They didn't even bring the harnesses. So you have regiments of professional soldiers standing around in the freezing mud, looking at thousands of pounds of bronze, completely impotent.
Think about this mechanically. You are attempting to reassert the absolute authority of the state. You need this to be swift, terrifying, and decisive. Instead, the military is forced into a posture of embarrassing paralysis. The troops are stuck on the hill, waiting for hours for someone in the command structure to realize the mistake, find the horses, requisition them, and march them across the city to Montmartre. And this delay is fatal to Thiers' entire grand strategy.
Because the delay allows the sun to come up. It allows the city to wake up.
And when they wake up, they see the army trying to steal their property. We have to analyze these cannons not just as military weapons, but as deeply symbolic proletarian property. The sources are very clear on the origin of these guns. These cannons were not state property provided by the Ministry of War.
Not at all.
They were paid for by public subscriptions from the National Guard themselves.
During the siege, the working people of Paris literally pooled their pennies, going without food, to forge those bronze guns to defend their city when they felt the government was failing to do so.
Exactly. They bought those cannons with their own starvation. So to the citizens of Montmartre, those cannons represented their right to arm themselves, their physical security, and their sovereign autonomy. When Thiers sent the army, he wasn't just trying to disarm an unruly city. He was actively stealing hard-earned working-class property to forcefully reestablish the bourgeois state's monopoly on violence. And the workers knew exactly what was happening.
Which brings us to the spark. The delay caused by the missing horses changes the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Because the first people to encounter the occupying troops are not the hardened, armed men of the National Guard rushing out of their barracks. It's the women.
The working-class women of Paris.
Yes. Early in the morning, around 7 a.m., the women of Montmartre go out into the streets to fetch their morning bread and milk, just as they do every day. Through the mist, they spot the regular troopsmen in the traditional blue tunics and red trousers of the line army, standing awkwardly around the neighborhood's cannons. The alarm is raised immediately.
Word spreads fast.
Residents break into the local churches and start frantically ringing the tocsin, the heavy alarm bells.
The sound of the tocsin is not just a bell. It is the traditional, visceral call to arms in French revolutionary history. It is a sound that carries across the rooftops, and every Parisian knows exactly what it means. It means the city is in mortal danger. It means drop everything and take to the streets.
And the response to that bell is instantaneous. People pour out of the tenements. But the crucial, heroic, and incredibly dangerous intervention here is driven primarily by the women. We have vivid, detailed accounts from Louise Michel, the famous anarchist, school teacher, and revolutionary who was right there on the ground in Montmartre.
What does she describe?
She describes women and children swarming up the hillside in a compact, furious mass. They don't attack the soldiers with weapons initially. They use a much more powerful tactic. They use their bodies.
They physically place themselves between the regular army troops and the cannons.
Exactly. They swarm the artillery pieces. They surround the machine guns. They get right up in the faces of the soldiers. The sources record them pleading, yelling, and asking directly, "Will you fire on us? On your brothers, our husbands, our children?"
They are aggressively appealing to the class solidarity of the line troops. Because we must analyze who these regular soldiers actually are. These are not elite, wealthy guardsmen. These regular soldiers of the line are exhausted peasants and working-class conscripts.
Just farm boys and factory workers in uniform.
Exactly. They are freezing. They are demoralized from the catastrophic loss to Prussia. They have spent the last 4 months suffering alongside the Parisians. Structurally, these soldiers have infinitely more in common with the starving women yelling at them on Montmartre than they do with Adolphe Thiers sitting comfortably in Versailles.
And the tension of this standoff reaches its absolute breaking point with the commanding officer on the scene, General Claude Lecomte.
Walk us through the mechanics of this confrontation.
General Lecomte is commanding the troops of the 88th Regiment on the hill. He is watching his authority evaporate. He sees the massive crowd of women and National Guardsmen surging forward, intermingling with his own men, breaking down the military formation.
Absolute chaos for a commander.
Right. He realizes that if he doesn't reassert dominance instantly, he is going to lose control of the regiment. So he makes the ultimate demand of military discipline. He gives his men the order to fire.
He orders them to fire at point-blank range into a crowd of unarmed women and his own citizens.
Yes. He screams the order, "Fire!" And the silence that follows is deafening. Nothing happens.
Wow.
His men stand completely still, their muskets lowered. The crowd doesn't retreat. They keep advancing, pressing closer. Lecomte is furious. He gives the order a second time. Still, the soldiers refuse to pull the trigger. He gives the order a third time, screaming frantically at his men, threatening them with execution for insubordination if they do not shoot the women.
And what do the soldiers do? This is the moment the entire structure pivots.
The soldiers of the 88th Regiment defy their commander. They make a physical gesture that changes history. They turn the butt ends of their heavy muskets up in the air.
Turning the musket butts up, the universal military sign of mutiny and surrender.
They break ranks completely. They step forward and fraternize with the crowd. They embrace the National Guardsmen. They weep with the women. And then, in a swift and violent reversal of power, Lecomte's own men seize him. They arrest their own general.
So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and analyze this structurally. This precise moment, the turning up of the musket butts, the refusal to fire on the women, represents the absolute catastrophic collapse of bourgeois state authority in Paris.
Because the military is the ultimate enforcer of the state.
Exactly. The military is the core of the state's repressive apparatus. It is the tool used to enforce the law of maturities, to enforce the evictions, to enforce the capitalist order when the laws are ignored. Without the military, the state is just a group of men writing words on paper in Versailles. And in the face of sheer, desperate proletarian class solidarity, that repressive tool just dissolves.
It evaporates.
The soldiers recognize that their class interests align perfectly with the women of Montmartre and directly conflict with the generals of Versailles. The state asked the military to enforce class rule, and the military chose their class over the state.
It is a profound, irreversible moment of fraternization. The authority of Versailles vanished in an instant.
And we must emphasize the structural role of the women in triggering this collapse. These women acted entirely outside of traditional political structures. They were not elected officials, they were entirely disenfranchised, without voting rights or legal standing. But driven by deep, compounding structural oppression, the double burden of class exploitation and the intense, horrific suffering of the siege, they literally sparked the transfer of power.
It was their courage that stopped the guns.
They halted the supreme military machine of the state with their physical presence and their moral outrage. It is a stark, revealing contrast to the bourgeois women of Versailles, who the sources later describe acting in a very different manner.
Ah, yes, during the repressions later on.
Later in the conflict, wealthy women in Versailles are recorded striking captured, bleeding, chained communard prisoners with their parasols and screaming for their immediate execution. The working-class women of Paris acted out of a desperate, protective solidarity to prevent violence. The bourgeois women acted out of terrified, vindictive vengeance to enforce violence.
That contrast really highlights the deep, irreconcilable class hatred that defined this entire conflict. The events of March 18th were not just a riot over some missing horses and artillery. It was a spontaneous revolution born out of 131 days of starvation, cynical legislative betrayal, and the fundamental realization by the working class that their own national government was a more dangerous enemy than the Prussians.
To summarize the massive historical arc of our deep dive today, we have examined how the agonizing material conditions of the Prussian siege forced an unbreakable, localized solidarity among the Parisian working class. We saw how the state, desperate to prevent chaos, unintentionally funded and armed this unified class through the 30 sou stipend, creating a democratized proletarian army.
Subsidizing their own downfall.
Exactly. We analyzed how the law of maturities and the end of the rent moratorium served as a ruthless economic assault intended to discipline the workers, but which structurally backfired, pushing the alienated middle class directly into the arms of the radicals. And finally, we witnessed how the farcical logistical failure of Thiers' dawn raid, the Forgotten Horses, provided the time for the working-class women of Paris to step in front of the guns, sparking the fraternization of the regular army and leading to the complete, spectacular collapse of the Third Republic's authority inside the city walls.
The cannons remained parked on the heights of Montmartre, but the power to command the city had irrevocably shifted to the armed people. The Paris Commune was officially born.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought to mull over before our next episode. It builds on something deeply unsettling found within the sources. The bourgeois state constantly justifies its actions by talking about order. When Thiers sent the troops in the freezing dark, he claimed it was an unfortunate necessity to maintain order and the rule of law.
But look at how they actually restore that order.
Right. Think about the nature of that order and what the state is willing to do when that order is successfully challenged by the very people it governs. The sources note a chilling postscript to this event. Months later, during the horrific Bloody Week in May, when the Versailles troops eventually fought their way back into Paris and retook the heights of Montmartre, they did not hold trials. They did not reestablish the rule of law.
No, it was just butchery.
They immediately gathered 49 people, including women and children who happened to be on the street, marched them to the exact same wall on the Rue des Rosiers where General Lecomte had been arrested, and shot them all dead in a mass execution.
A dark, brutal echo of March 18th.
So ask yourself, when a state loses its monopoly on violence and eventually marshals the resources to take it back by force, does it act out of a genuine desire for justice, order, and the restoration of law? Or does it act out of pure, unadulterated, terror-driven vengeance for having its vulnerabilities so publicly exposed to the world?
It is a crucial question to keep in mind as we move forward into analyzing the 72 days of the Commune's actual radical existence.
Indeed it is. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the spark that ignited Paris. Be sure to join us for episode 4 of The Spark in the Cannon, where we will dive into exactly what the working class does when they suddenly find themselves in absolute control of a global metropolis. Until then, keep digging into the history.